Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be hailing from. This is Into the Terminal, episode 27. Today we're going to be talking about using logs for troubleshooting. I'm Eric, the IT guy Hendricks, and joining me every single episode is my trusty co-host, Mr. Scott McBrien.
Hello.
So, I'm sure as a former sysadmin, we've both been in situations where we've tried to run a service or we've tried to do a thing and it doesn't work. There is an extensive system of tools built into Red Hat Enterprise Linux to in order to figure out what's going on. It is a troubleshooting, it's an investigatory process, and the logging system within Linux is designed to help us do exactly that. The problem is, sometimes it can be a little daunting to look at log files and go, I have no idea. Is this working? Is it not? So today we wanted to dive in and do some troubleshooting. So Scott, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, and I would disagree. Like, I don't know if the logging system is designed to help us as much as it's designed to just be like complete, and it's up to us to figure out what's actually in there and how it applies to us.
That's fair.
Um, so we're looking at a Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9 system here. But everything we're going to talk about today is the same on 8 and 9, and I think even 7. Um, so the first thing is the log files themselves. So most log stuff is going to be stored in rlog. And you can see it for some services like Apache, there are subdirectories. So that HTTPD subdirectory there, that's where Apache puts its stuff. But then there's a bunch of system logs. And so probably the two that are the most interesting are messages and secure. Messages catches pretty much everything on the system except for authentication and those types of errors. Those go into varlog secure. And then it also doesn't catch things like mail messages from the mailing services. Those go into varlog mail log. Spooler is where cron logs, I'm sorry, varlog cron rather is where cron logs go. Spooler is where like print things go. And we'll talk a little bit after the transition on how we decide what goes where. But for the purposes of our first cut, let's just take a look at varlog messages and varlog secure. So in one of our early episodes, we talked about tail. And tail just lets us look at the bottom part of a file. So these are the logs that are at the bottom part of my varlog messages file. Varlog messages catches a lot of data. And so we can see here it's getting some messages from systemd and DNF. This is around building the cache for packages, right? So that's what these messages are about. How do I know that? Well, I've been around a bit to be able to interpret that output. But we could see things like R right here. This is a message that we might recognize from a DNF transaction as an example. So that's what we're looking at there. But one of the critical skills that we have for an administrator is a lot of times you'll be trying to troubleshoot a problem and you know about when that problem happened. And you'll notice that the log messages here have a very specific time format, right? It's the month, day, and then the time. So what I've used a lot is using grep to pull out just those logs in the time frame I'm interested in. So if I wanted to see all the logs that were generated in 1408 today, I can say grep for June space because notice there's two spaces there of 1408, my time code. And because I'm not binding the second field, it'll match everything in the 1408 time code. So these are all the messages that happened in that 1 minute in the varlog messages file. And if I wanted to go wider, maybe I wanted everything from 1406, 7, and 8. So I can use a square bracket in my grep to say this character position will be one of these three values, right? So we can see that we get 14.0. Well, we don't have any 1406 messages, but 1407, 1408 is in here. So that's a place where you can kind of use grep to filter down what you're pulling out of this file for a little bit of additional data analysis.
And I think it bears mentioning briefly that all the time codes are in UTC.
It is on this system. It typically will use local time. So this machine is set to use UTC, which is why it's logging in UTC. If we had set this machine to be Eastern Standard Time, then the log files would be stored in Eastern Standard Time as well. So the time zone configuration that you're asked to do as part of your installation, it's kind of important because it's used here too. So yeah. The other thing that we might look at is you'll notice that the log messages, in addition to their date timestamp, they have their host name. We have a really nasty looking host name with UUID. Then we get a program. This is a process ID. And then lastly, we have the message data that was transmitted. So the other thing we can do with grep is we can say, hey, let's, we don't care about the time. Let's just look for all ENF in our var log messages. And so we can get all the instances of this. And we actually did a little bit of pre-population before the episode, and we logged some messages from a service called RHEL. Let me clear the screen to make it a little easier.
Would you like to play a game?
Would you like to play a game? And then we also preceded some messages, not just here to var log messages, but also to var log secure from our RHEL service. So these are kind of the tools that you use for looking through logs for specific things. And you can combine regular expressions together. So we can look for HAL messages from a certain period of time. Or if we know the message content, like maybe we're looking for a message that has the word error in it. Well, we could grep for the word error through our logs and find out all the times where that occurs and see them.
So we had a question in chat that I wanted to bring to the surface. Maybe give us a little bit more context. But one thing I did want to mention about checking logs in a format is that logs, just like a lot of the configuration files, follow a standardized layout. So we just did some basic searching using the grep command. But you can really go in there, and if you look back to some of our other episodes, we talked about how to cut certain columns or how to pipe commands into different spaces. So if we really wanted to get granular and pull out specific events around a specific time from a specific user, we could do that by piping together some search criteria. So if we wanted everything that the HAL system service did between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., we could do that with a series of grep commands. This also comes into play when you look at third-party logging systems, like I used Nagios or OpenNMS or other systems in the past, and being able to follow the standardized format allowed those third-party tools to pull that log data in, to do some analysis, to up-level like warning or error level messages, and really help sort of collect all the information that we need and kind of massage that to our needs. So if you had a more specific question, feel free to throw that in the chat. If you have any questions, join us in the Discord chat or on YouTube and Twitch. Excuse me. So we noticed that we have some customized messages in here, namely quotes from our buddy Hal from 2001: Space Odyssey. If you're trying to place some of these quotes, uh, so how did we get these messages in here? I could see using this as a systems administrator to say, uh, "System, our maintenance window opens now." That way, I know I can look for that message, and then anything that's logged after that would be part of a maintenance window. So I could pull some after action reports or something like that. So how did we get these messages into our logging stream?
A great question. So let's step back for a second before we go into that specific thing. So as an application developer, you can hook into the syslog um, system and produce syslog error message or syslog messages, which then get caught by the syslog service and filed away in different locations. And we'll take a look at the syslog configuration in just a minute. But so there's like an application development layer of how you integrate to logging. And that's going to be somewhat determined by the language framework that you're using on how you actually do that and like how you form the message and what options are available to you to customize the message. But for the shell, we have a command called logger. Let me clear my message here. And you can, whoops, spell it correctly. You can just say logger and a message that you want to go to syslog. Right, and it's going to traverse the syslog rules, which we'll talk about in a second, and it will end up in one of the syslog files. And so if I do a tail on rlog messages, right there's my logger error that I just put in. Right, so it literally just takes the string that you pass it and sends it to syslog, and then syslog decides how to file it away. Logger has a whole bunch of options for it. And so, for example, for our example, I used a tag. By default, logger will use the username of the person running the logger command. But I put in tag Hal. Right? And we can see that now that error message that I just put in comes from the Hal service. And then the third thing that we can do is we can pass what's called the facility and priority to the information or to the log message. So I can use -p to set the priority. And let's do I don't know, let's do a info level message. And then let's also do a auth-priv error message. Oh, and you know what I need to do? One second. Error 3. If I have a distinguishable text that we can find. All right. So based off of that priority, there's a class of severities that get passed with log messages, and there's also a set of what we call facilities, right? Facilities are like an extra tag that tells the kind of log message it is. And these two parameters of facility and priority get determined by syslog to show where this log should be reflected in the log files. All right, so let's see. Just looking back at the chat here, I don't see any additional questions. So let's just take a quick look at log messages, right? And we can see that error 2 and error 3 landed in there. But notice that error 4 did not land in here. Error 4 ended up in our log secure, right there. All right, so why did these messages go different places when I changed the priority and facility that they came from? All right, so that is determined by the syslog configuration. And for RHEL 7, 8, and 9, we ship rsyslog, which is remote syslog by default. And if we look down at the rules, The rules tell us what we should do with different messages that we get. So remember when I set that auth error message? Well, this is why it ended up in varlog secure, because any service level that is tagged as auth this is any priority message. So error would be included in that any priorities. That should go into varlog secure. And then doubled with that is up here, the rule that controls what goes into varlog messages. We say no auth messages should find their way into varlog messages. So when we get a message to syslog, it marches through this list of rules and it will log the error or the message that it received in any of the rules that match the message. So if I have a message that matches both the varlog messages line and the varlog secure line, it would be logged both places. But because we have this exemption for auth here in varlog messages, we make sure we don't dual log those. So that's why we were doing that. So anything that is from the auth facility goes into varlog secure. This one says any facility priority info or higher. Right, so let me show you an example of one that doesn't match that. So here I'm saying, let's log error 77 as a priority debug. But our rule in syslog says only priority info or higher, debug falls below that threshold. So if I do a tail in varlog messages, we don't see it logged. It would have to match another rule to be logged in some other file because it didn't match the rules for what we look for to put things in varlog messages. All right, I see we have a question about writing custom rules. So yeah, we could do that.
It's almost as if the audience knew where we were going with this example.
Exactly. All right. I'm just going to go down to the end of my rules and I'm going to add one. Actually, that says debugger higher. What is it? Dot equal, maybe? I'll have to look up the syntax for that. Okay, so let me do my last logger here. Log. Okay. Right, so that message got handled because in my syslog messages or syslog rules, I now have this rule that says if any service sends me an exactly equal to debug priority message, it should go into this file. And so it didn't match any of the other rules, so we shouldn't see it in any of the other files, but it did match this one, so it got put into this this log message. So that's kind of how you determine where logs fall into your local system. Notice up here it actually has a message here. So anything that's priority emergency gets broadcast all different places. We can see that UCP and news messages that are priority critical or higher, they go to varlog spooler. So that tells you what goes into each of these log files maintained by rsyslog. So I did want to point out one other thing around logs. So we just added a new log to the system, varlog debug, and it logs all debug messages. And there's a reason why we don't log debug messages by default. Eric, why do you think we don't log debug messages by default?
I most certainly have never made this mistake in my career. Debug logs literally log everything. It's every system call, anything you can possibly imagine. And even though it's just text, it is amazing how quick an active application set to debug logging can fill up a disk.
Right. And so,
Which
especially
free
when
pro
you,
tip. This is why one of the best practices for Linux systems is to have /var/log set as a separate partition. That way, if your logging fills up, it doesn't crash your server. Again, I've never done that. I had a friend tell me that that's what happened.
well, and a lot of security standards like
Mm-hmm.
DISASTIG or CIS, they suggest that you or require that you put var on a separate file system. And some of them even say var log needs to be on a separate file system to avoid just this. But what we're now doing is we're capturing a whole bunch of data that we weren't capturing before. And that is a concern. Like, what do we do with all that data? So I may stump Eric here. I think he knows the answer though. We'll see.
Uh-oh.
So we have another thing that runs that kind of grooms and controls those log files. Do you remember
Oh,
what it is?
I know it's your friend. I'm gonna ask the audience. It's not prune something. Yeah, I actually don't remember the name off the top of my head. Log rotate. There it is.
Oh, there you go. You got it.
I figured it
All
out
right.
all by myself.
So we have log rotate, right? And log rotate takes care of rotating log files. And so there's a whole bunch of parameters on what we rotate and how frequently we rotate, and you can set things like sizes. But this new file that we just created may not be covered in our log rotate settings. So we would want to go in and just double check our log rotate configuration that this new file we created has some rules, and maybe it needs different rules. Maybe we need to rotate it more frequently, or we need to look specifically for its size to get rid of it. Maybe we don't want to keep 4 back copies of it like the default log rotate rules here say. Maybe we only want to keep 1 copy of it for and maybe it needs to be rotated daily instead of weekly.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the rsyslog rotate.d directory. And this is where you can put really specific log rules that you want. You can override the defaults. And you can see here we also have an rsyslog one. Oops. And so this is what rotates the normal syslog provided log files. Notice varlog debug, the one that we created, isn't in there. So we would want to create an entry somewhere. And based off of needing more or more frequent rotations or keeping less copies of previously rotated files, you might choose to actually create a separate file in rsyslog rotate.d to handle this new one that we created. But that's where you can go to determine things like those GNU-zipped back stored copies of logs and how frequently they're done and how many you keep and things like that.
And I used log rotate quite a bit back in my sysadmin days because certain audit logs or transaction logs needed to be kept for years for financial audit reasons. So dealing with a lot of the financial systems, we actually had to add files to logrotate.d in order to take those zipped up log files and ship them off to a tape drive that was available on the network. So having log rotate really helped, and I want to go and kick myself for not remembering that off the top of my head. But log rotate is your friend because that's what helps keep you from filling up either your file partition or your var log directory. It manages the pruning and the zipping up of log files, and then the ultimate deletion of those files. So make sure that log rotate is set up and running on your system. It is by default. In fact, the defaults are incredibly effective, but but when you start logging like database transaction logs, all that kind of thing, it really starts to get disk management definitely becomes a thing. Um, so I kind of mentioned log rotate with tape drives. Do you want to address this other question about shipping critical logs off of a machine to a logging server?
Sure. So that one is a little bit of extra rsyslog configuration. Um, and I actually hadn't prepared that for this episode, so we'll have to fly by the seat of our pants a little bit. Um, but essentially, you can, in addition to having syslog take your messages and based off the rules, put them in different files locally, you can also have it take those messages and send them to another rsyslog server. So let's go back into the rsyslog configuration. And the rule looks something like this. Um, yeah, I think. Let me just double check real quick. Or maybe it's not at. I know there's an example somewhere in here.
Right. And this is something I kind of alluded to offhand earlier. Um, we had I remember working with vendors like Logarithm was one of the ones at the time, and I know there's countless others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But having a centralized data store for log systems that helped keep your systems clean and gave you a single interface to go in and look at your logs across your fleet of systems. Great questions in the chat today. Really appreciate you all showing up live and hanging out with us. Yeah, I have to agree. Having a good understanding of our syslog definitely provides some job security. If you got any other questions while we're looking up the syntax here, feel free to put them in chat. We got a few more minutes before we wrap for the day.
All right, and I'm going to have to punt on the how do we log to a remote server because it looks like it's a little bit more involved than I remember it being.
Hmm.
So let's take that line out because it'll break my rsyslog and we won't be logging anymore. And maybe we'll do a follow-up episode to talk about that. Um, I know that you can send logs to a variety of places, and then on the receiving server, you can actually put in rules that say for this host, this facility, this priority, you can put it this file or put it in this directory, so you can manage it that way. And we had talked briefly about that in our session recording um, episode. You'll recall, Eric, we were talking about like taking those recorded sessions, which were really stored as logs, and shipping them off to somewhere else for storage so you don't have to rely on the local system.
Definitely. Yeah, this is
Cool.
one area where session recording would come into play as well.
Yeah. So I saw another question from Aiden. He was asking about UCP and news.
I missed that one. There it is.
So he was noticing, let's go back into the rsyslog here. He was noticing this one. So once upon a time, there was such a thing as news groups. And we had software that provided news groups on our servers and was a network service that offered browsing and usage of newsgroup data stored on the server. And that's what these guys are. So if you were using those services, your stuff would go into Varlog Spooler for messages from those services. So that's what that is. Let's see if there's anything in there right now. Yeah. So we're not using those here on my default RHEL 9 install, so we don't see any messages there in Varlog Spooler. So again, in Varlog, the ones I think that are most important are messages because it catches pretty much everything, and secure because it catches authentication privileged messages, the authpriv messages. And then you may see individual application ones like the Apache ones, or right here, this is the Red Hat Subscription Manager log directory. So if you're having problems registering your subscription, that would be where I'd go to find information on that. Hayden asks, or like security updates. Well, that depends. So,
That is your default answer for everything.
yeah, it really depends on what is being sent to our system, right? So right here, these two rules control it. One is no auth-priv service messages should go to varlog messages, right? So that's why we don't see any over there. And then right here, all auth-priv messages of any priority go into varlog secure. So if we use logger, and we send a log message, we see it here in our varlog secure. Now also, because it was a debug level log, it's going to go into our custom debug log file too, right here. So whatever service is being sent, we use that priority and criticality, or I should say facility and priority, to determine where it goes based off of our syslog rules. So if your service is sending things as from authpriv, it's going to end up in varlog secure. If your service is sending something as another facility, it's going to end up in another file because varlog secure only accepts authpriv service messages. And if we take a look at the man page for logger, down at the bottom, it actually tells you all the services that you can use. Right, so these are the services that we're looking to send things as the first component of that priority message. And then here are the criticality names or level names. So I was using .error, but we also use .debug, and then there's a couple others like warning and notice and some others. And they go from down here at the bottom. Debug is the least important log. Emerge is the most important log. And that's why we have special rules in our syslog, like the one that covers emerge, that will actually send broadcast messages to the terminals, the logged in terminal sessions.
And we had one more question in the chat that I wanted to up level before we wrap for the day, and that was what is the audit directory in varlog?
So the audit directory is from the auditd service. So prior to Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8, if you wanted to get information about what people were doing during their sessions, you needed to use a service called auditd. And that would put all of its log data of that logged message data in var log audit and some directories and files down there. Auditd is very expansive. You can like have it log anytime someone opens a file in the system, or have it log anytime someone uses chmod to change the permissions of a file on the system. So auditd has this like whole host of configuration and rules where you can have it store information about activities happening on your machine. And that data goes into varlog audit. And depending on what you're logging with your auditd, that can be a huge amount of data. So things like log rotate also become very important for that. Mm-hmm. So the most prevalent use of that had been logging people's sessions, like what they were doing during their sessions. And so with RHEL 8, we made that a lot simpler by just including tlog and the session recording infrastructure. So that you can log that data in another format, so you don't have to log all the other things that person is doing, like file opens and executions of commands and a whole bunch of other things behind the scenes. So if you still want to do auditing, you can, still include it with RHEL. But if you're using sessions for auditing, session recording is the better choice.
Awesome. Great conversation in chat today. Thank you all very much for joining us live. If you're interested in diving in more to these topics, you can join Mr. McBrien this evening for dark mode, and then join us next week. We'll be talking about system roles. There's some new system roles in RHEL 9, as well as we'll go through the basics of how do you get started with system roles and how do you configure. We'll configure a couple of different services live on air. What could possibly go wrong with that? In fact, if you're interested in RHEL 9, yesterday, Mr. McBrien and Matthew Yee and joined Brian and I on RHEL Presents for What's New in RHEL 9 episode of RHEL Presents. So if you missed that, go catch it. Also, Summit sessions are available at red.ht/summit. So there's tons of content, tons of stuff around. Tons of content around RHEL 9. So tons of content anywhere. Definitely post your questions in the comments afterwards. Scott and I both check those throughout the day, throughout the week. So we love the engagement. It really helps us spend more time creating content just like this. So with that said, please like, subscribe, share, just do all the things, because that helps us spend more time doing content like this. But other than that, on behalf of Scott McBrien and the rest of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux team, thank you all so much for joining us on Into the Terminal, and we will see you next week.